Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of 14th to 18th century poetry. The topic of today's lecture is John Donne, and in this lecture I am going to introduce the poet John Donne to you. I am your teacher Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Dear students, discussion agenda for this lecture is that first of all I will give you the brief introduction of the poet, and it includes the information about the education of the poet. After that I will come to the topic that is metaphysical poetry, because it is one of the chief characteristic of John Donne. So we will discuss this type of poetry in brief. It will be followed by the discussion on John Donne's style, and subsequently we will discuss the range of John Donne's poetry. This lecture also includes the discussion on the characteristics and the theme of the poetry of John Donne. And in the end of this lecture, I will give you the list of important works of John Donne. So starting from the introduction, the poet John Donne was born on 22nd January 1572 and he died on 31st March 1631. This very time period is that time period in the history of English literature when Queen Elizabeth was ruling the British Empire, and we see the flowering of Renaissance, or we see a rebirth in the knowledge. In that background, John Donne is very important because he was the one who was going against the flow of the time, and he was coming with the new experiments in the poetry. As I told you that he was a famous English poet, but the special thing is that he was also a priest, lawyer, and one of the renowned scholar of that very time. He belonged to a Catholic family, and Catholicism was at great trouble at that time for the people who were living in that day England, because Queen Elizabeth changed the official religion of Britain from Catholicism to the Protestant sect, and we see there is a long story of hardships for the Catholic families. And John Donne also suffered all these things, and in the late years of his life he converted to the Protestantism, and then he was offered the post, and from 1621 to 1631 he remained the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The main feature of the poetry of John Donne is the metaphysical aspect of this poet, and he is the paramount representative of the metaphysical poets. And his works are especially noted for their metaphorical and sensual style. Now let's move towards the education of John Donne. He got his early education privately because it was the normal trend that often kids were taught at home, and the same happened there. John Donne was educated privately during his early years. Then he was sent to the Hart Hall School at Oxford, and he was sent there in 1583 when he was 11 years old. But we see that after 3 years of studies there, John was admitted to the University of Cambridge, where he studied for another 3 years. But unfortunately he couldn't obtain the degree for either that Hart Hall, Oxford, and in the Cambridge also, because from either institutions he has to take an oath of supremacy, and because he was Catholic he refused to take that oath. That was the main requirement to get that graduation. So he studied at Oxford, also studied at Cambridge, but couldn't obtain the degree. After that, we see in 1591 he was accepted as a student at the Thames in Legal School, one of the renowned law school at London. And he also studied in the Lincoln School of Law. He got admission there in 1592. So this is the educational career. He studied in Oxford, also at Cambridge, and he also got the law education. But unfortunately, he didn't complete these degrees because of his Catholic background. Now let's move towards the metaphysical poetry. And the term metaphysics, this very term belongs to philosophy. It means something supernatural and transcendental. And it suggests that something beyond physical. We see that something that is beyond physical. So metaphysical poetry deals with metaphysical subjects. Those subjects which does not come under the domain of material beings. So this very metaphysical poetry is basically concerned with the fundamental problems of life and death, and it also deals with the soul, and it covers the life after death. It includes the subjects like nature of universe, the movements of stars and planets, and the whole relationship of man to God. So main characteristics of metaphysical poetry are novel and new thoughts and expressions. We see that conceit is there, wit, obscurity, and that pedantic show of learning is also there in the metaphysical poetry. That is the style of poetry of which style John Donne was the paramount representative. And now let's move specifically towards John Donne's style. And his style in the poetry, there are abrupt openings, and there is a variety of paradoxes. We also find ironies and displacements or dislocations. He is often using these very things where he is dislocating or displacing the things from the normal routines. So Donne is considered a master of the metaphysical conceit. And what is metaphysical conceit? I will give you here a brief description of this very concept and explain the concept in the coming slides also. Conceit is basically an extended metaphor. It is the metaphor. Sometimes we see that it even extends up to the whole poem. And this extended metaphor combines two vastly different ideas into a single idea. And most of the time it is using imagery. But the special thing is that it is extended metaphor, and it combines two very different ideas and bring these ideas into a single idea. And the special thing is that this very metaphysical conceit is very different from the conceit that was found in the Elizabethan poetry. And we see that in Elizabethan poetry we find patriarchal conceit, which formed cliched comparisons. And these very things are more closely related objects, such as rose and love is metaphorically compared, and we do not see that extended and widely different ideas in these very conceits. In metaphysical conceits, we see that there is a great depth in comparing two completely unlike objects. One of the most famous of the Donne's conceit is found in the poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning. I will discuss this poem in detail also, but here I am just giving you the reference of the metaphysical conceit. We see in this poem John Donne compares the apprentice of two separate levers to the working of the legs of a compass. It means that two levers were metaphorically compared to the legs of a compass. So this is the special aspect of the metaphysical conceit. Now let's move towards the range of Donne's poetry. We see that on the one hand, John Donne wrote one of the most passionate love poems in the English language, And on the other side, we see that he is the one who came with the most moving religious verses. That is the speciality. And that on the one side, he is dealing with love, and on the other side, we see that he is addressing another extreme of life, and that is of religion. So in his poetry, we find both of these aspects. So he wrote different types of poems, and these poems include satires, elegies. We also have verse letters, songs, sonnets, love poems, religious poems, epigrams, and holy sonnets or divine poems are also there. And the special thing is that he also wrote Latin translations, and he is also famous for his religious sermons, which he wrote in prose, that are also masterpieces. We can divide the works of John Donne in 3 stages. The first stage covers the young age, and the second stage covers the middle age of John Donne, and the third stage covers the old age. We see in the young age there we find elegies, and he also wrote satires in which he condemns the contemporary issues of that society. In that age, we also find the love poems that he wrote, and in those passionate love poems, we see erotic poetry. Then comes the second stage, the middle age. There we see the poetry of platonic love, and in the old age, he wrote a very religious poetry. And he also wrote sermons in the old age. So these are the 3 stages. So another division for the poetry of John Donne is that it can be separated into 3 compartments. The first one is amorous poetry, and the second one is metaphysical poetry, and the third one is satirical poetry. Common subjects that are found in the poetry of John Donne is love, death, and religion. So love, especially in his early life, death, especially after his wife's death, and we also see religion in the last part of his life. So this is the wide range of John Donne's poetry. Now let's see the characteristics of John Donne's poetry. He was, as I told you earlier, that he belongs to Elizabethan age, but we see a departure from Elizabethan trend in his poetry. Elizabethan poetry is basically a decorative and flowery poetry, and it has images that harmonize with images. So simply, the imagery which we found in the Elizabethan poetry is very simple. Donne's poetry is very different from the Elizabethan trend, because this very poetry is written largely on conceit, and Donne's poetry has concentrated images that involves dramatic contrasts. This is not the simple image that harmonize with the other images. It has very concentrated images which has very deep meanings. Another aspect of Donne's poetry is that it has intellectual difficulty. It is not easy to understand the meanings of his words. In Donne's poetry, we see that traditional flowers of that decorative poetry completely disappeared. The love poetry of John Donne is completely different. In the love poetry of Donne, we never encounter bleeding hearts, cheeks like roses, lips like cherries, or teeth like pearls. Neither we encounter the cupids shooting arrows of love. Even if we have tears in the poetry of John Donne, these very tears are different from the ordinary saline fluid of unhappy lovers. They are ciphers, they are knots, they are symbols of the world's emptiness. So these tears are very concentrated images, and these very images have intellectual difficulty. So that is the departure from the Elizabethan trend. In his poetry, we find blend of wit and seriousness, As I described to you in the earlier slides, his poetry has extremes of imagination on the different possibilities. Like if we see that love, for him love has two possibilities. On the one side it is love, and on the other hand it is devotion. And for describing these imaginations, he blends wit and seriousness of the intense feelings or that darting mobile thoughts. And he also blends vast learning in this very poetry. So from this blend of wit and seriousness, he creates a fascination that is quite beyond the reach of easier styles that were often being seen in the poetry of the Elizabethans. And that very style is beyond the reach of the less strenuous minds. If you are not trying to understand that concept, it is very difficult to reach the actual meanings which John Donne wants to narrate to you. So this poetry is blend of wit and seriousness. Another aspect of John Donne's poetry is that it covers unconventional topics. As I told you that his poetry is having a very wide range, and he wrote in different styles. Here we also see that John Donne's poems sometimes appear very shocking because they represent very unconventional topics, and he represented these unconventional topics under very unconventional circumstances. So that is the uniqueness of John Donne, that he comes with unconventional topics. His imagery, Donne has a very versatile genius, and Donne's versatile genius drew images from everything and everywhere. We see the earth, moon, sun, the stars, the geometrical instruments, the alchemist, alembicu. All these things are providing images to the Donne's genius. So his imagery is that instrument which provides the reason to the readers to read his poetry. So the reason is that he was deeply read in scholasticism and medieval sciences. So he was well versed in these very things, and this is depicted in the imagery which he uses in his poetry, and this imagery attracts the readers. So his poetry comprises of new thoughts and expressions, and Donne's poetry is purely intellectual, and it makes an appeal to the intellectuals. Itself it is intellectual poetry, comprises of the new thoughts and new expressions with very unconventional topics and unconventional type of imagery. We see it appeals to the intellectuals, and the reason is that his thoughts are very unique, very new, and the manner in which he expressed his thought, that is also very new. In short, he played with thoughts, and we find these examples in his works like The Canonization, The Flea, and the work like Death Be Not Proud. We can easily identify the new thoughts and expressions in his works. Another characteristic of John Donne's poetry is obscurity, and this is one of the important feature of his poetry. In his poetry we find obscurity and vagueness of subject, and basically it is linked with the sensibility of the literary wit and philosophical conceptions. He includes very unique ideas, and he drew imagery from that wide range, and it is coming from very unconventional sources. So it creates that obscurity in his works. You need to be very careful when you are studying John Donne, because it has intellectual depth, and it is not easy to crack the real meanings without putting real effort. So he frequently combines very dissimilar ideas, and thus his poetry is very harsh, obscure, and puzzling. So wit is one of the chief element of his metaphysical poetry, and it is found everywhere in his works. So it fashions his feelings and thoughts. The style of John Donne is embedded in the wit. But we see that his passion, sentiments, and sensuality, all these are subordinated to the wit. And we also see that his wit is unique in discovering of comparisons and analogies. His wit is very realistic and straightforward, and it looks to run side by side with the humor he uses and with the irony he is using in his poetry. So all these heterogeneous or that material which is coming from the different branches of knowledge, we see that these very materials are compelled into a unity by the rapid association of his thought and his wit. So wit is that feature that is found everywhere in the Donne's poetry. Now, as I told you earlier, that conceit is the most important concept in the poetry of John Donne, and it is also the important feature of the metaphysical poetry. It is that very feature which is found in abundance in the poetry of John Donne. Conceit is the instrument that is being used by John Donne to reveal his wit. So the conceit is comparison between two unlike objects or things. In short, it is a far-fetched comparison. And we see that in his poetry, in John Donne's poetry, the conceits which he is using are very far-fetched, and that turns his imagery into obscurity. We can easily point out some of the conceits in John Donne poetry, and the most popular poem, The Flea, in which we see that the flea becomes the marriage bed for the lovers, it is because it bites the beloved after biting the poet. So Donne says, this flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. So see how he compared marriage bed with the flea that has sucked the blood of the lover and a beloved. So that is the special aspect of John Donne's poetry, which is very unique and which is very different from the conceits that were there in the Elizabethan time. So the themes in John Donne's poetry are also very unconventional. We see belittling of the cosmic forces in the poem which we will study in the course, that is Death Be Not Proud. This very sonnet shows how the poet feels about death. It is to be neither loathed or feared, as it is simply the gateway to another life. To him it is a gateway. So this is the belittling of the cosmic forces. We also see that in the sun rising, he belittles the sun as simply a lesser light compared to his lover, and their love is portrayed as more important than the whole world. Another theme that he covers in his poetry is regarding the religion, and a great deal of Donne's poetry is exclusively divine, and even more secular poems often contain a heavy dose of the religious thoughts and meanings. So religion is one of the important themes, and this is the reason that we find often the topics that are very much related to the death and life hereafter. Another important theme of John Donne's poetry is love, and we see love is being treated in his poetry both as a physical thing and as a spiritual experience. So in Donne, loving someone is as much a religious experience as a physical one. So his love transcends mere physicality, and we see it is of a higher order than that of a simple, mundane, ordinary lovers. So he is the one who comes with the themes like that of the interconnectedness of humanity. One of his famous statement is, "No man is an island, complete unto himself." This very statement directs his readers to an often overlooked aspect of John Donne's metaphysical thinking. He sees every man and woman as spiritually interrelated, noting this very thing, that the death of one person severely affects every human being that is living around him. So interconnectedness of humanity is another theme. In the same way, in the fidelity of the woman, that is an important theme of his poetry, and writers in John Donne's time often express negative views of women, and the same we find in some of the poems of John Donne, where he expresses such views with very biting forces. So I'm not going into that detail, but fidelity is one of the theme that we find in John Donne's poetry. We also find paradoxes. That is very important to John Donne, because in it he sees the resolution of the problems of the man. So paradoxes and conceits are those important statements that actually get his reader's mind. In the end of this lecture, I will just list some important works of John Donne, like The Good Morrow, Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, Death Be Not Proud, The Sun Rising, The Canonization, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Go and Catch a Falling Star, The Progress of the Soul, An Anatomy of the World. This is analogy. And The Progress of the Soul, and Metapsychosis. These are some of the important works. There is very long list, and it is very difficult to list all of them here in this lecture. So thank you very much for listening passionately. I hope that now you will be having a clear idea about the poet John Donne, and in the coming lectures I will explain 4 of the important works of John Donne to you. Thank you very much.